Hello, this video will be about the US Capitol building, obviously in Washington, D.C. I'll put a link in the description to a video I did about the White House, and I'm going to revisit all of this and do a larger series because it's not just the White House, it's not just the Capitol building, it's not just the Supreme Court building, Union Station, Martin Luther King Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, Korea War Memorial, World War II Memorial, and a bunch of others that I can't remember at the moment. Well, the House of the Temple, the George Washington National Masonic Memorial, all of these structures, the city itself, the city plan, but also the individual pieces of architecture are loaded with the Hermetic code, entirely built around it, and that all these structures from the beginning up until the present day, the most recent memorials, for instance, all follow this code in an exquisite manner, beautiful pattern. But for instance, just a street plan, there you see the Capitol building in the center and this owlish shape around it. Now that's not exclusive to Washington, because Washington is one of four very important cities around the world, capital cities: Canberra, Australia, Brasilia, Brazil, Astana in Kazakhstan, and Washington in the USA. All of them follow exactly the same plan. They're from different cultures, different times, and yet they, again, exquisitely follow the plan. But here's from Google Earth view. So we're down in the front. We're just looking out towards the Washington Monument. And here we are at the front of the Capitol building. On the western side of the building, so back facing down towards the mall. And yeah, so this is a Google Earth view. Now, for instance, we have these columns here on the outside. Now, each one of those columns is of the Corinthian order. We'll get into that shortly, but just in one of those little Google Earth snafus is, there's your Illuminati confirmed with identical twins walking. Look, obviously it's just a glitch, but still, I think, you've seen too many things on the internet with people would take something like this and just extract it out to the infinite possibilities. But anyway, let's stick with facts, to put it mildly. And so, yeah, this video will be focused on the US Capitol building and how the architecture is entirely hermetic. It has a secret code, a secret plan, written mostly in weights and measures, but there's no shortage of symbolism as well, because you cannot remove separate the two. Now, this is the Capitol building from the eastern side. Now, just behind us would be the Supreme Court building, which is another one, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And these being three of the most important buildings, the power centers of Washington, but of the USA as a whole. And each one of them, of course, with so many other buildings, important, the most important, the most, Washington Monument, for instance, all of them are imbued, built from the ground up, the footpaths, the building itself, proportions, all of it entirely hermetic. And the US Capitol being the center of the geometry of Washington is the most important. Now, essentially, in a symbolic sense at least, it is the power center of the United States. However, in realpolitik, it doesn't necessarily work out like this. But let's go back to the beginning of the Capitol building, 1793, and the Cornerstone Ceremony. Very important point, because, well, it's like there's a whole system that goes with the construction of important buildings, cathedrals, temples, and one of those most important, well, firstly, it's laying out the plan, but also laying the cornerstone is the, if you want to call when the building is conception, and then we have the pregnancy during which it's built, and then we have the birth of the building with the dedication. Here are some of the tools used with it. These are very important tools, especially in regards to the cornerstone ceremony, and especially with masonry. Now, the tripod, key symbol, you'll see it very often in Masonic artworks, and the cornerstone being laid for it. Now, there was also a Masonic procession. There's a clip from an article at the time in regards to who was in the procession, the order of it. But there are a few interesting points. Now, to begin with, they mentioned corn, wine, and oil. Well, when you lay a cornerstone, now this was the time capsule for the Massachusetts state capitol, and they rededicated the time capsule. Oil, grain, and wine, oil, grain, and oil. And so corn, of course, is a grain, Native American grain, and so sometimes it's wheat, sometimes barley, and in the Americas, especially sometimes coins. Now you also notice that they mention the stone cutters. Now most of even the Masonic sources will say that the stone cutters it does not exist, that it's completely invention of the Simpsons. Well, that's not necessary, because there's a difference between a stonemason and a stone cutter. This also goes back to the cathedrals, etc. But I won't go into that for now. But what they also mention alongside the stone cutters is the mechanics. Now, the Independent Order of Mechanics is a centuries-old fraternal organisation, very much arranged in Masonic themes and rituals and symbolism, emblems. And so the mechanics are they're not very well known, but they are very, very real. And so along with the stone cutters now, and that's one of the things with so-called official Masonic sites. Well, I'm not on the inside, but from the outside, well, there's more than enough evidence. So I think just as a side note, you should never take those sites literally, not because they're trying to deceive, but because they don't know. This is a really big aspect of history. So much goes into it. I don't pretend to know even a percentage of it. It's millennia old. But anyway, with that, we'll move on. So now let's take a look at symbolism and survey surrounding the U.S. Capitol building in Washington. And I did a series on called Hermetic America, where I went through state capitals, discussing the measurements, symbols, cornerstone ceremonies, the exact same pattern what's happening here. But there's no shortage of visual symbolism in regards to the Capitol building. And so here we see the rotunda, which is directly under the dome, and that's one of the main places for this. And so as we start to look up towards the dome, when it comes to these things, number is so important. It's whether it's you're talking about Platonic Platonism or Pythagoreanism, number is at the essence of this geometry, especially. So here we see what's called the apotheosis of George Washington, the painting which is at the top of the dome. And apotheosis, essentially like becoming a god, essentially, is what's happening there. But you'll see that there was all the classic symbols of Greco-Roman gods series, like Poseidon, Neptune, Mercury, Hermes there, and they are of particular importance. And rather than go through all, but the caduceus of Hermes and the trident of Neptune/Poseidon. Hermes, or Mercury, as known by the Roman gods, the god of weights and measures, the god of commerce and of travellers, and especially to do with knowledge, cleverness. Science is also like one way to consider it. But in that mural, we see George Washington. Of course, not only was he a Mason, he was what you might call, just like Lachlan Macquarie, Governor Lachlan Macquarie here in Australia, he was a conscientious Freemason and very interested in survey. But there we see the way that George Washington is positioned in comparison to a famous statue for the centenary of his birth or inauguration. I'm unsure now, I forget which one. But going back to, I did a series on New York in regards to the symbolism. Again, as above, so below, all very hermetic. And this classic image of Baphomet, which is usually described as some sort of satanic thing. Well, it's actually an alchemical series of alchemical astronomical emblems, which is again just misunderstood intentionally by some people because they're in search for boogeymen under the bed covers. They're always looking, to if you can portray someone as evil, therefore it somehow sort of makes you good. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. George Washington, very interested in survey, just like Lachlan Macquarie here in Australia. And you'll see that these, because survey is important for architecture, as in buildings, but town planning. And how do you create a perfect country, nation? Well, you begin with the floor plan, and here are some of the survey tools, such as the chain, measuring chain, and of course these were owned by George Washington. Now, he was very interested in survey, but he was not the surveyor. He basically issued the orders through Jefferson, and they would come down to Andrew Ellicott. But there we see the original not the milestones, but the boundary markers of Washington DC, the District of Columbia, as in Columba the Dove. Forget this Christopher Columbus thing, because there are countries that have no connection at all to Christopher Columbus, but are full of Columbian, as in Columba the Dove symbolism. Okay, the boundary stones, the Jones Point Lighthouse is the southernmost there, and in regards to survey, we also have the Jefferson Pier, which is just underneath the Washington Monument. That is a survey marker. That square, the boundary stones, which define the area of Washington DC, they're spaced roughly a mile apart, but they are not milestones, because a milestone will give you like the distance in miles to the center of the town. They're much more like these Hermstones, ancient, connected to Hermes, but Hermstones, as in bit like hermaphrodite, as in Hermaphroditos, the child of Mercury and Venus. Hermstones define a sacred place, define a sacred precinct. For instance, in ancient times, the temple precinct would be defined by Hermstones, and that's what those boundary markers actually are. They're boundary markers and not milestone markers. Now, back to one of the original designs for Washington, and in the bottom you can see also the original White House design and the US Capitol design, the US Capitol being at the center of this geometric plan. The geometry itself contains quite a bit of symbolic, but also some much more important information. I'll go into that in the future, but Pierre Charles L'Enfant was the original designer of this particular plan, but because of issues, personality conflicts, these sorts of things, it was actually Andrew Ellicott which completed the design and did almost all the survey work in regards to this. So L'Enfant was the original architect of this particular design, but it was Andrew Ellicott who was the surveyor, and he finished the design, and some changes made between Ellicott's final design and the original of Pierre Charles L'Enfant. A few other parts, but we'll go into those. Okay, next section.
They're all covered with filthy germs, aren't they, Smithers?
Why, what do you mean, sir?
Freemasons run the country!
Ew.
Okay, so now we'll look at some of the standard symbols, designs, decorations that go into Capitol buildings. And again, in previous videos I've shown how you'll find these are all over the place. Now, the swastika, for instance, or the Philfot, this is in the Congress building, but you'll also see the designs, the upholstery on the chairs. And, well, this upholstery was, I'm guessing, come after World War II. And again, so this swastika goes back centuries and centuries, millennia before World War II. It's part of the design now. What you'll also find in many Capitol buildings are famous givers of law. But now, for instance, the Ten Commandments and Moses, one of the classic historical lawgivers. But what's important is that you notice that he has these horns on there. That's another common theme, hidden in plain sight, so to speak, in regards marking these things out. On their own, not so much. When you bring them in together, you start to see the plan. Now, Freemason tracing board, we have the three columns, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Now, you'll also find these three orders, the Greek orders of architecture, in the Capitol building. For instance, Doric colonnades in the rotunda. In the chamber, the Ionic columns, and we also are now on the outside. We also will have the exterior. All the columns on the exterior are of the Corinthian order. Each one of these has a very specific meaning and a very important in regards, well, especially to Freemasonry. But this goes back to Greco-Roman times. But what do they mean? Well, for one thing, they have connections to measurement and therefore to number, and therefore being very important because all is number, as in the Pythagorean schools. Because at 288 feet high, it creates not only a lovely conversion point between the ancient Doric and Ionic scale, and I should add that the so-called modern foot is at least 2,500 years old, as shown by the Salamis stone, as proven through many ancient structures. But what we have is a harmony point between various sets of measures, including the Doric and the Ionic scale of measures. And not only is it beautiful because it's at whole numbers, but there's a whole deeper level of symbolism in regards to Doric, Ionic, and the Corinthian columns. Multiple layers. And so if we begin with, there we see a Ionic, but okay, so the Doric column, the earliest and the most simple, is a representation of the male. It's called a column of strength, and it also has connection to sight. As where the Ionic column is describes the woman, it's called the column of wisdom, and it's connected to touch, as in feeling. In that way, now the curls on the Ionic columns are said to represent the simple beauty of a woman and her hairstyle, the simple curls. So, pardon, what we have is Doric and Ionic has length measurements. But what's important about Doric and Ionic especially, and this is not exclusive, but they are also important as systems of music. And again, we'll go back to Athanasius Kircher, a very important figure in regards to Hermeticism. And music was one of the things that he focused on, and there we can see on the left-hand side, there we get a close-up, the Scala Musicala, or the musical scales. Now, apart from having the instruments there as well, including wind and string, percussion as well, that's an important part, but he also highlights the different musical modes, including the I don't think I've actually highlighted it there, I should have, but the Dorian and the Ionian, or the Doric and the Ionic. And of course, as a style of architecture, has a system of measurement, also as a system of music. So where the Doric and the Ionic are very important, because again, the concept of harmony and unity and of many things coming together. And as we shall see, the numbers which emerge from the 288 feet height of the Capitol building are loaded with this type of stuff. Now, of those three columns, the third is the Corinthian, which is which is called the column of beauty, which is connected to the Virgin or the Maiden. And the very elaborate style indicates the elaborate hairstyles and jewelry and stuff that, like, especially a young unmarried woman in those times would make herself as beautiful as she can for marriage. Now, what's also important about the Corinthian column is it's connected to the broken column, but the Corinthian design is based upon the acanthus leaf and this acanthus plant, and that in itself is hugely important. There is so much information loaded in the history of acanthus that eventually I'll get around to it, but it's mind-blowing stuff. But now let's have a look with a focus on the US Capitol building and how it has musical information encoded in it. Now remember, the 7 liberal arts, especially the quadrivium, the 4 higher of them: geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music. All of these things come together, and the architecture is one of the most important points in this. But before we go into music, I'm going to play a clip from excellent cartoon, Donald Duck in Mathemagic Land, talking about Pythagorean schools and music and so forth. Anyway, this is a cool little clip.
Journey through the wonderland of mathematics.
Mathematics? That's for eggheads.
Eggheads? Now hold on, Donald. You like music, don't you?
Yep.
Well, without eggheads, there would be no music. Come on. Let's go to ancient Greece, to the time of Pythagoras, the master egghead of them all.
Pythagoras?
The father of mathematics and music.
Mathematics and music?
Ah, you'll find mathematics in the darndest places. Watch. First, we'll need a string. Stretch it good and tight, plunk it. Now divide in half. Plunk again. You see? It's the same tone, 1 octave higher. Now divide the next section. And the next. Pythagoras discovered the octave had a ratio of 2 to 1. With simple fractions, he got this. And from this harmony in numbers developed the musical scale of today.
By golly, you do find mathematics in the darndest places.
You can imagine how excited Pythagoras was when he shared his findings with his pals, a fraternity of eggheads, known as the Pythagoreans.
They used to meet in secret to discuss their mathematical discoveries. Only members were allowed to attend. They had a secret emblem, the pentagram. Let's see what the topic is for today.
What's going on?
It's a jam session.
Give me something with a beat.
So from these eggheads, the Pythagoreans, with their mathematical formula, came the basis of our music of today.
So music and math, geometry as well, of course, very important to the Pythagorean tradition. And the legacy of Pythagoras, really can be found in so many places. Now, for instance, Chartres Cathedral, there, the figure on the right-hand side, that's Pythagoras. The Chartres Cathedral also includes the 7 liberal arts, which is at the core of this particular field. There is geometry in the humming of the strings. There is music in the spacing of the spheres. Now, this concept is very important because, there's a famous quote, not sure who said it, geometry is music frozen in time. And this concept of all is number, of harmony between various systems of measurement of length or area or volume, first, second and third dimension, how they connect to astronomical proportions, how they connect to musical proportions, and at the core of it, arithmetic. But strictly speaking, let's look at Pythagoras and music, and there is geometry in the hummings of the strings, there is music in the spacing of the spheres. Now we need to have a look at what's called the Pythagorean hammers, and also the tetractys or the tetragrammaton, which is something I mention a lot in my videos. Now, that particular painting, of course, not at the time of Pythagoras, but it does show the tetractys there, the dots there, 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. Well, this connects to what's called Pythagorean hammers. So Pythagoras come across the foundations of musical tuning by listening to 4 blacksmiths hammering away. He caught onto it, he rushed inside to see what was happening. He noticed that the proportion, pardon for the misspell there, of the weights of the hammers was very important, very specific, and from that Pythagorean tuning emerged. Now, 1492, the Theory of Music by Frank Gaffiero, I don't know if that's the pronunciation, but there was an interesting little diagram there, quite important as well, because if you pay close attention, look say for instance on the strings there. Now you'll see that there's weights tensioning the strings, 16, 12, 9 and 8. Now on the pipes there as well, you'll see that there are numbers attached as well, the same sets of numbers, 16, 12, 9, 8, so forth. It goes down. Now you also see him on the bells, but also glass bottle bells or a xylophone. And again, the same sets of numbers. Now, these are clearly musical instruments, but why does he show a team of blacksmiths at the hammers? Well, that's the Pythagorean hammers. It was the hammering of the blacksmiths that gave him this tune, and it was the proportion of weight between the hammers that was very important as well, at least as the legend goes. So we do still now in carillons, bell towers, it's all very important. You see them in orchestras, again, like woodwind and pipes, again, classic musical instruments and strings as well. So these are immediately recognizable as elements of music. No one would miss that. However, the fact that he's got the blacksmiths beating there on the hammers, well, those are the Pythagorean hammers, and the hammers that the 4 blacksmiths, according to the legend, 12, 9, 8 and 6 pounds. So these are the Pythagorean hammers, which will lead us to the Pythagorean tuning scale and the US Capitol, as well, all this sacred architecture, but this is about the US Capitol building. Geometry, astronomy, arithmetic and music are essential elements in all this design, and understanding of the Platonic schools, as well as especially the Pythagorean schools in this tradition, and it's a clear tradition throughout architecture, including Chartres Cathedral, which was built before the Corpus Hermetica arrived in Europe. It was always there, it never left, it just was not written about. Okay, so back to so we see the lyre, musical instrument, and the tetractys. How does that connect to the Pythagorean hammers, the famous hammers from the blacksmith shop? Well, 12, 9, 8 and 6 pounds was those weights. And if we compare them to the tetractys and have a look at some basic music theory, so we have the perfect fourth, 3-to-4 ratio, and we see how those hammers, how the 12 and the 9, as well as the 8 and the 6, have this 4-to-3 ratio, and how that is, of course, standard within the Tetractys, but we also have 3 to 2 or the perfect fifth, and now we see 3 and 2. So again, the Tetractys, music, geometry, arithmetic, and as we'll see, also astronomy and the Pythagorean schools. Now 9/8 is giving a whole tone. Now music's not my thing, so this is pretty much copy paste, if you want to say, information off there, but people who are into music have commented and have seen especially connections Doric and Ionic in the musical scales as well as these. So, but either way, back to the US Capitol building. Why was it 288 feet high? Well, for a number of reasons, and to begin with, on the so-called modern scale of imperial measures, but also on the Doric and also on the Ionic, we get a harmony point where it's all whole numbers. But not just are they whole numbers, they're very beautiful whole numbers and very much connected to all sorts of musical information. And I'll begin with Pythagorean tuning for the minor pentatonic scale. This is Ben Johnson wrote on this, and again it follows the same basic rules. But for instance, 64. Well, the width of the rotunda, 96 feet, or 64 cubits. Now 72, there are 72 stars around the dome, around the mural in the center of the dome, the apotheosis of George Washington. The height of the Capitol building, 288 feet, or 810 Doric hands, now 81. Now the width of the rotunda is 96 feet, but we also get the yards, so it's 96 yards high, and the rotunda is 96 feet wide, and again we get this connection. And we get to 108. Well, 108 windows in the dome, 1080. I've even skipped one on the Ionic scale there, 10,800. And also on the rotunda we get it, and on the depth of the of the Capitol building as well, we get that same number. But so back to the Pythagorean hammers and the standard Pythagorean tuning, A432, and there we see a harmonic chart. But we'll get again the same set of information coming now, as we didn't get. Okay, well, I won't go into that for the moment, but well, for instance, at 192 cubits high, we get 192 G. It's 288 feet high, the rotunda 288 hand wide, 288, of course, being D in Pythagorean tuning. And we'll go through these numbers because they're not just important to music, they're not just important to measurement, they're important to all weights and measures. Music, but of course we'll have a look at time, and of course astronomy, geometry, and of course this beautiful arithmetic which emerges from all these numbers. So A432 on the Doric scale, 4,320 fingers in height. And you'll see how some of the numbers will be only on one scale, but they'll also be doubled up. Now I've also, 324, the width of the rotunda, 96 feet, or 3,240 Doric grains, and E, 324 hertz. So we saw earlier pentatonic tuning, which is on the 5-note scale, but then we also go into these other tuning scales, and again there's a lot more information in regards to this, and this is not my area where I'm most comfortable talking about this. I don't script anything I do, I just set the pictures up and start, so anyway, what we have here is we see the beginnings. There's some lovely musical information to begin with in the sets of these proportions, and how weights and ancient weights and measure systems tally up with it. And so, for instance, just as a comparison between the two, on the pentatonic scale, 64, 72 is also on the harmonic chart of numbers, which is a very beautiful. It's just like 2 squared times 3 squared across, and then 2 cubed across, times 3 squared times 3 to the first, 3 to the second, 3 to the third. It's dimensions of 2 and dimensions of 3, and this chart has all of this information in there. But you get a good, more than a majority of the important information is in this harmonics chart. Now there are other numbers like 273 and a couple of others, 33, which you will not find on this chart, but they do connect beautifully. Now we didn't have 54 on, or 250. Well, we didn't have, like for instance on the pentatonic tuning we didn't have 54, but 54 is on the Pythagorean chart. So music, there's the idea. Now even in a more literal sense, these buildings, just like the cathedrals, are designed to have you know, you can hear it in the echo. So if you walk into a really nice church, or if you walk into one of these state capitals, because of the materials they've used and because of the design of the building, it has this audio effect. It has an echo, and the way, and you know, you can like hear it, like, you know, especially even just the footsteps as people walk along, and you know, like you can, it resonates throughout the whole building. And so music, geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic, the quadrivium, and we're beginning here with music. So not only is the building, as you know, people who have visited, I have not visited this building, but people who have, you know, anyway, if you've ever been in any one of these buildings, you know, courthouses are the same, the old-fashioned courthouses, not the new ones, but music is very important to this element of design. But there's something else, and that's and this is just one more factor of it, the element of time. The importance of time cannot be underestimated. It's more than just the clock, and it's more than just dividing the day up, because it has applications to many things, none the least being navigation. But in regards to the Capitol building, so again we see the height, the rotunda width, as well as the depth of the building. And in these, well, we're going to see many connections to time, not just modern time, but also ancient connections to time, and more than just the day, hours, minutes and seconds. But time, yes, very important theme, which will link to so many others, and none the least is the connection to the meter. Now, despite what moaning Carl might go on about, the history of the meter, I did a video regarding to Metabunk in regards to this. It's piss poor, and again, it's like really poor research. So many aspects of this, but most people will refer it back to 1791, and well, it actually goes back centuries. In solid records, goes back centuries earlier. But well, the year before 1791. George Washington asked Jefferson to devise new weights and measures for the new country of America, and they were going to define the foot, or hence the yard, as a 1 second pendulum. And so, so essentially 3 feet would have been 1 meter. And well, a 1 meter pendulum, swing it, and it gives you a 1 second span. So 1 meter equals 1 second, and that goes back at least to the 16th century, but in fact much earlier than that. But it also will connect to music, because just like a metronome, we use time to measure music as well. And how do we measure time? It comes from length. Length, time, all these things all join together, and you'll find that they're, curiously enough, that they're at the same harmonic numbers, which, as we earlier showed with music, well, time corresponds beautifully to that. And well, to begin with, so 3,600 seconds per hour. We see 3,600, 360 and 36. Also consider a 360 degree compass in this as well. But that's, so seconds per hour, those units are included. The width of the rotunda, 1440. They're all 1440 minutes per day. So we have seconds per hour, we have minutes per day, and the height of the US Capitol building, 864 hand. Well, there are 86,400 seconds per day. Back to that 1 meter pendulum. That's where it emerges from. Now, another expression of time is precession, or the great year, and there are 72 years per 1 degree of precession. So I didn't include the degree symbol, but you should get the point. Now precession is very important, and in future episodes in this series in regards to Washington, where I'll try and put more things together because it really expands out. But anyway, sticking with 360 of a Mayan calendar, 360 days for 1 tun or ton. I'm not sure of the exact pronunciation there. But what we're going to see in this next section is how systems of time for the Mayans, for the early Hindu, very, very old religion, and even the Sumerian are all linked into this. So at 360 and 72, now 1440 once more, 1 Baktun, 144,000 days. Now if you're familiar with the Bible numbers, well, again you'll see this, and again we'll go into it more. I'm just sticking to time for the moment. And so we start to see the presence of the Mayan calendar, how it connects now. 288 feet high Capitol building, the rotunda being 288 hands wide. 288, such a beautiful number in regards to these things, one of the most perfect numbers out there. But anyway, the Pictun, if that's the pronunciation again, 288, 40 days. Now, so 36, 72, 144, 288, all of these numbers, of course, being the importance of this system, as I mentioned earlier, how Doric and Ionic, and there is more to this because we have to include the Indus, ancient Indus scales, the Royal Babylonian scales, and other scales of measure, how they all come together at beautiful, beautiful points. 1152, still again, we're staying with the Mayan calendar, so we start to see how these, in this chaotic randomness, infinite sea of numbers, how now this is just a US Capitol building. I've done countless videos, countless hours going through so many other places, not just in America, in my home country of Australia, ancient temples, cathedrals, all these things. It's all in there, it's in there all the time. It's a fundamental point to this type of architecture, and they chose these measures. These are architecture, engineered, designed, intentional. Now the Yugas, so we've gone through the Mayan calendar, let's look at the Yugas now. The whole calendar of the Yugas also is 432,0000, but the Kali Yuga 432,000 years, 432, of course, connecting. Now in the divine years, that's 1200, and once more we're going to see that system again, because on the Cremona scale, as well as Doric and Ionic, we get 1200, 120 as well. So this same pattern, we're just talking about shifted decimal, sometimes exact number, or a shifted decimal point here, but each one of these even on their own, whether it's 36, 360, 3600 for instance, how these all break down. And just in regards to that last point, so the Yuga is broken down, so you have the complete number of years, you have the divine years, but you also have a period of like transition when you enter it, then you have the chunky part in the middle, and then a transition period towards the end of the Yuga. And so for instance, the Vipara Yuga, 864,000 years, 864,000 miles diameter of the sun, but anyway, that's for future. At 2400 divine years, think 24 hours a day, for instance. Now 24 does not appear on these measures, but I'm only talking about the width of the rotunda, the height and the depth, and the dome features. There are other important features in regards to the US Capitol building, and all the ones that you notice might have been missing, well, you can fill them out as well. But again, I'm just trying to stay on, on the core dimensions of it: the width, the height, the depth, the rotunda being the central, the key feature. This is at the very heart of the building, and this building is at the very heart of power. It's at the very heart of the geometry of the city as well. The Treta Yuga, 1,296,000 years. There are 1,296,000 seconds on the compass, for instance. Now 360 degrees on the compass, 3,600 divine years, we get this as well. But also, so 108,000 years the entry, 1,080,000 years the chunky part, and 108,000 years towards the end. And what's the other number which defines the height, the rotunda, the number of windows in the dome, also the depth of the building? 108 once more. So that's the first three of the 4 yugas, and we bring in the Satya Yuga, 1728,000 years. Now 1728 is built into all the other bits of architecture, but okay, 4800 divine years, and we get this same, well, of course, appears multiple times across multiple scales of apparently unconnected weights and measures, and 1440 or 144,000. Again, it's all in there. In coincidence, it's a symphony of coincidence, which not just connects the Capitol building, but it will connect the Supreme Court, the White House, all the major monuments, memorials, public buildings across Washington, and I'll do them in future episodes. I'm just sort of laying down the track here now. I'll put a link in the description box to a video I posted, one of the most recent ones in regards to the White House, because we have the same thing. Okay, Sumerian Antediluvian Kings List. The pre-flood antediluvian being pre-flood Kings List. Now, there are different the translations of it, but we essentially, so even in the differences between them, we find the same pattern. So whether it's 36, 72, and we'll see more so 108, for instance, as well. 108, again, just if there's a number worth remembering, it's 108. Now, okay, 288, I mentioned. Well, what connects these two numbers? Well, 288, 2 plus 8 plus 8 equals 18, 1, 8, 1 plus 8 equals 9, 108, 1 plus 0 plus 8 equals 9, of course. In recreational number theory, it's called a Hashad number, where it's divisible by its digits. And this is what a very simple way that this was able to be achieved, because of, if you basically set your numbers up around a grouping of 9, you'll get this sort of magic stuff happening here. But antediluvian, the pre-flood kings list. Then the flood happened. The flood is described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, tablet 11. Gilgamesh went to see his ancestor Utnapishtim, who recounts the story of the flood, who built an ark, and he describes the ark in some detail in tablet 11 from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's essentially describing a cube, 120 cubits wide, 120 cubits deep, 120 cubits high. And this is where all this black cube stuff comes from. Now, there's a lot of BS in regards to Saturn cults and all this other stuff. It's in the measures. Now, whether it's, you can apply this to New Jerusalem, you get exactly the same thing. This is what the cube is about. It's a conversion tool which contains astronomical, musical, arithmetic, and geometry information. But so once more, those same sets of numbers which gave us definitions of time, definitions of music, staying with the Capitol building. Now I'm not going to, I'm using the major dimensions of the building. I'm not cherry picking little rooms. Now I could do that and I would fill out the rest of the chart. But even those so-called little rooms, which I said are actually like key chambers within the building. And this is at the heart of power. This is an important building. So 120 cubits wide, 120 cubits high. Royal Babylonian cubits. Now Royal Babylonian, in the scale, one of their cubits is 1.5 feet, therefore 120 cubits. Royal Babylonian is 180 Royal Babylonian feet. We have 180 there as well. So that will also convert in the Royal Babylonian scale to 3,600 fingers. That's the same things happening again in this. Now, you can either be religionist, be a hardcore fundamentalist and say, this is all coincidence. I was taught that the ancients were just all dumb people. We're at the end of history. We're the highest level. Everyone else is dumb and superstitious, but like I was born in the perfect generation where we know everything. We're so rational. We're so smart. Well, good on you. You don't know what you're talking about. Because these are weights and measures. These were civilizations. Those were societies who existed for thousands of years, hundreds of years. They were not dumb. They understood quite a bit, and they achieved. Just look at the architecture of the ancient world and what they achieved without a calculator and without the tools that we can't get out of bed in the morning. They did this with basic stuff, and they were bloody geniuses. And it's a disservice by the standard counts. But anyway, 108. So the dimensions of it. But this is important because in Tablet 11 also describes how much bitumen, pitch, and oil went into it. So so far we've been talking measures, one-dimensional measures of distance. This is measures of capacity as well, and so they've put a double reference into there, and then they've repeated that reference several times. Now, it even says, so the amount of oil which was stored, some of it was consumed during construction, so we had 36 and 72 once more. Now, 72 plus 36 is 108, so there's another 108 reference to there in the dome, but I'm not including that because, once you start adding, dividing things, you can pull out any number you want. So I try to stick with the undeniable, the key features in regards to this architecture. Now, 1440, not only do we have the edge length, combined edge length, 144, but also the area. So we've gone from a one-dimensional measure of length into two-dimensional measure of area, and that will also bring us to 432, as in 432A, 432 Hertz tuning. And that's not all, because that's the maximum visible surface area. Now, if you say, well, that's I'm cherry picking, well, we have to. What's the total area? 86,400 cubits total surface area, 86,400 seconds per day, plus all the other information that comes off that, and we'll list that in the future. But I've just been going through time, music, time, and also now measurement, first dimension, second dimension, as well as third dimension, because we're talking capacity. Like when you measure a drum, whether you're carrying oil or pitch, you're doing the volume, a third dimensional understanding of measurement, which again is important because these ancient civilizations were our system of trade. You go buy a can of drink, it's got the measures on it. You buy some chips, it's got the measures on it. You buy meat, they're going to measure it. Whatever you buy, it's measured, and it's the foundation of our society. So whether it's time, distance, weight, temperature, and we're going to examine all these things in the future, but it's all in there. It's all repeated, and in this. Coincidence be damned, because it's just so it's harder to find. Actually, not harder. I have not. The more I look, I do not find things that do not match. If you know, in the great civilizations, the great religious texts, it all comes back to this same system. Beautiful system, and so that's pretty much it for this episode. I'll do some more on the Capitol building, and then I'll get to a whole map of Washington, because every monument, every major public building in Washington carries this same set of information, from the earliest buildings and memorials up until the most recent ones. And so with that, hope you enjoyed and have a good one.